Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am so excited and happy to bring you the conversation I had with Toby Matthiesen. Toby is a historian and political scientist with a focus on the Mideast and global Islam. He's been a senior research fellow in international relations in the Mideast at St. Antony's College, University of Oxford, where he's taught courses on international relations in the Mideast, politics of the Mideast, and the history and society of the Gulf states. He remains an associate member of Oxford University's Department of Politics and International Relations. He is also the Marie Curie Global Fellow at Stanford University, and soon to be later this year, he is at the University of Bristol as senior lecturer in global religious studies and global Islam. He's written a handful of books, including the most recent, The Caliph and the Imam, The Making of Sunnism and Shiism, which is a global history of Sunni-Shia relations. And that's what we talk about in this conversation. I forgot how I came across this book, but I was able to get it and read it, and it was, just a really opening of my understanding, not only of Islam, but also of, I guess you could say, global history and global politics. Of course, Islam is one of the major religions of the world. Over 1 billion people are practicing Islam. And I think we do a great disservice to ourselves if we don't understand something that has captivated the hearts and minds of billions of people on the planet. And I really kind of walked away from reading the book, and certainly after having the conversation with Toby about what all of these kind of different divisions and the relations of various aspects of Islam are about, where they come from, their history. And so it's very informational, but I think it's also really helpful in trying to understand a little bit more when folks engage with, their peers or friends that may be Muslim and have a more, open understanding of things, and hopefully it can be very helpful in that way. At least it was for me. We start by talking about this kind of divide of Sunni versus, Shia, and he talks about in the book and in the conversation of why that's not true entirely, to make it a kind of us versus them. Of course, there are moments where they've, it's been more acrimonious, but a lot of times it's, coexisting or living together at different points in history. Some are positive or negative, but it's not exactly a us versus them type of way of framing it, and it's probably a poor framing. We talk about the origins of Islam, starting with the Prophet Mohammad, and most importantly, where this all kind of ramps up, is this idea of succession. After the Prophet died, how does Islam kind of carry forward? So we talk about that. We talk about the various schools of jurisprudence. We talk about the Shia century and the interactions there with the Crusades. We talk about the role of the Ottoman Empire with Islam. Of course, if you do any type of history, read any book or study anything of history in the past 1,000 years globally, you're going to eventually bump into the Ottomans. They were, obviously around for over 600 years, so super essential for global history. Talk about the impact of the Safavids with the Ottomans. Talk about Wahaabism, the British rule and how they organized Islamic laws in India, modernization of the Ottoman Empire, pan-Islam and nationalism in the 20th century, Turkey and how they became more modern in the 20th century, the Ba'ath Party and the making of Baathism, the Muslim Brotherhood, the U.S. involvement in the Middle East, the Arab Spring, the Syrian conflict, which is still ongoing, unfortunately, and many other topics. Again, it was, just an absolute delight to talk with Toby. I really, really enjoyed this conversation immensely. I thought about it for days after. Just really opened and broadened my horizons of understanding religion and global history and people groups. And he's just fantastic. His book is extremely well researched. It's really a kind of tour de force in that way. Very accessible, easy to read, a lot of information, and I think it's just very, very, very helpful. So I can't recommend that book more highly. It's fantastic, and he's absolutely wonderful to engage with, and just a wonderful person. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations, past and upcoming, at convergingdialogues.substack.com. Get over there, subscribe, tell your friends, share all the things. Also on YouTube, you can subscribe there as well. Trying to continue to make this stuff accessible for everybody. And so I also would welcome any engagement you have on listening to these conversations and any other questions and things like that. So subscribe and share and all the wonderful stuff there. And now I bring you Toby Matthiesen. I am here with Toby Matthiesen. Toby, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm really looking forward to this.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have written a fabulous book that I absolutely just kind of inhaled. It's not a lot of, I can't find, at least in English, a lot of books that have a kind of really good history of this topic in one place. And so it's obviously well researched, as we were talking about before we got on. The book is called The Caliph and the Imam, The Making of Sunnism and Shiism. So this is something that I haven't talked about too much on the podcast. So I'm very excited to get all of your hard research and work downloaded here. So I'm very excited. So before we get into it, just tell listeners who you are, what your background is, professionally, educationally, all that good stuff, and what you're currently up to.
Sure. I'm Toby Matthiesen. I'm currently a Marie Curie Global Research Fellow at Stanford and at Ca' Foscari in Venice, and joining the University of Bristol as a senior lecturer in global Islam after the summer. And I've quite, for many years worked, broadly speaking, on this topic, on sort of, confessional relations in the Muslim world, in the Middle East, the politics of the Middle East and its modern history, at numerous universities, including Oxford and Cambridge and SOAS and so on and so forth. So yes, but this is my first sort of attempt to put all of these, wider questions into one book and try to answer sort of broader questions and write for a broader audience as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, I think it's much needed. So I've been really excited to talk about these topics. I guess just a few kind of particulars. How long did it take you to write the book? So it's a pretty big book, as it should be. As I was saying, it's well researched. I'm assuming you're at least familiar with many of the languages of the region, Arabic. I'm assuming at least some familiarity, if not fluency. But yeah, how I guess just a little bit real quick. How was the process, and how long did it take, and all that stuff? I'm very interested in this.
I mean, broadly speaking, I've been interested in this topic for the last 15 years. My PhD was sort of on a sub-theme of this broader topic on Saudi Arabia, especially, and the Shia minority in Saudi Arabia and its relationship with the state, and also with Iran and sort of, Gulf Shia and their relationship with Iran and Saudi and so on. So broadly speaking, I've been trying to think about this for 15 years, and people have been asking me to sort of write a wider account for quite a while. But really, the proper process for this book started, I guess, in 2015, 2016. So about 8 years. And I also didn't necessarily expect it to take so long or to end up being so long, but I think that's what happens if you delve into a pretty big topic and also try to do it justice.
Yeah. So let's start with I think we can define the terms, I guess, but I feel like we'll just kind of start somewhat in modern times or contemporary. So when people, I think, at least in the so-called West, people will have ideas about Islam, right? It's a major religion. People might know about the Prophet Mohammad, the Quran, the kind of basic stuff, and people will know there's many different kinds of divisions, like there is with any religion. So how do we how do many people make of this Sunni Shia divide or split, and which again is something that you uh, do very well in the book to say like these these two different if you will factions aren't pitted against each other necessarily, although some people try to make that narrative. But um, yeah, how do we understand just kind of more just as a general prelude of this kind of Sunni divide, and maybe why that's maybe not so accurate, I guess, at least currently.
Yeah, I mean, the problem in a way already starts with sort of terminology and how we approach the subject, because sort of the history of the study of religion in sort of universities in the Europe and the United States and so on, sociology of religion in the 19th century and 20th century was largely based on the study of Christianity and Judaism to a lesser extent. But so, in Christianity, as we all know, I mean, the sort of the major split, in a sense, happened in the Reformation, much later in a completely different scenario from when the religion was first founded. And so a lot of terminology is sort of associated with that. So sort of the church and the sect, in a sense, of the sect splitting off from the mainstream, like in a Protestant way, and protesting against sort of the church's path and so on and so forth. And so people then, when they started writing about other religions, compared and used the same terminology to try to make sense of other religions. Now, when it comes to Islam, the topic of this book, this doesn't make much sense, because the original split happened right after the death of the Prophet Mohammad, and the different branches sort of developed for many, for 1,400 years, and in and of themselves are sort of consistent, and they don't see themselves as a sect or a split off from the mainstream. I mean, there are various tendencies that see themselves as the mainstream. So I mean, one of the first problems that I had with the book, or some of the things that I'm trying to do, is try to get away from that loaded terminology that people have. So I rarely use the term sect or sectarianism, for example. But I try to do justice, especially to Sunnism and Shiism as the two main branches of Islam that, in and of themselves can be pretty, I mean, they can be consistent in themselves, even though the other side might criticize what they're doing. But, they see themselves both as sort of the mainstream of Islam. And this is in some ways new, because Shiism has often been seen as a sort of a side aspect of mainstream Islam. So if you look at like previous history books of Islam, or how it is taught in schools or universities historically, Shiism was often seen just sort of as a split off sort of from mainstream Islam, which was Sunnism. So in the book, I'm trying to be more inclusive and look at the relationship between the different branches.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think it's a nice way of kind of setting up the tone. So we'll come to the major divide in a minute, or the way it's branched out, but I guess just kind of give us the broad overview of the Prophet Muhammad, how Islam began in the 7th century, middle of the 7th century. And it seems to be, I think other people have noted this, that there was this difference in style between Muhammad of Medina and Muhammad of Mecca. Is kind of a difference there. So yeah, just kind of give us the broad overview of just kind of him, and then how Islam kind of started, and then what was it about kind of succession after he passed, and how people started to kind of follow him. I mean, anytime there's a new religion or a new following, let's say at the time, it doesn't necessarily take off, and you can see again other examples of this like with Christianity. But yeah, so just kind of give us the broad overview.
Yes, I mean, this might take quite a while, so I'm just going to
as
give
much
you
as much runway as you need.
Short overview.
Go ahead.
But of course, initially, when the Prophet Muhammad received the revelation and sort of proclaimed himself as a prophet of God, there were only a few followers, and for a while it was actually quite difficult. And it took a while to have a sort of mass appeal, and when that came, sort of these early followers had, of course, a special status. So in a sense, like, embracing the cause earlier was seen as, as more worthy, or, than later. So, and here we're right, getting sort of to the heart of the matter, because Sunnis and Shias sort of disagree over who were the first followers and who were the most important followers. Because then, towards later in his life, the new religion Islam had a mass appeal, and immediately spread pretty fast, pretty quickly. But succession was not officially regulated, or not in a way that broadly speaking all Muslims would accept. So after his death, there was immediately disagreement about who would succeed him, and by that time, the Muslims already controlled pretty large parts of the Arabian Peninsula, and went further out. So this was an incredibly important questions, and so. Some people said that Abu Bakr was, of course, should be his main successor, and others said no, it should be Ali. Those who favored Abu Bakr would today be considered the Sunnis, and those who favored Ali would today be considered the Shia. I mean, this is another issue. These terms were not used at the time, Sunni and Shia. They were later on, written into the history, or given to these groups, and so the meaning of these terms also changed. One has to be careful. Ali eventually became the fourth caliph, accepted by Sunnis as well. So Ali is a crucial figure in this story. He's very revered by Sunnis and by Shia, but his particular position is seen as different by Shia. The Shia think he and his offspring were actually designated by the Prophet, something the Sunnis don't accept as his actual successor, and that they had some special charisma and knowledge, and that the bloodline was very important for succession, and that this family of the Prophet, the Ahl al-Bayt, as they're also called, were wronged right from the start. So I mean, in the book I make the argument that afterwards, there was, the question was largely political. In different centuries it could matter more or less. But ultimately, it is at the start, really, of the religion that this fundamental disagreement took place, and that has been invoked ever since by various factions and so on.
Yeah, so I think you say in the book, in good way to point out that obviously these terms weren't used at the time, but what we would know today is that there was Sunnis, that the succession was based on the community's elite, on merit, and Shia is based on the succession was based on designation of his cousin, I believe, Ali, and then all of the subsequent offspring. And so, I mean, is it too reductionistic to say these two major groups that are, again, there's a whole long history here between many centuries, but that it really was, I don't want to say a disagreement, but it was basically one group is saying, like, in terms of like closeness to the prophet, it was, this is somebody, a kind of a bloodline or a type of bloodline, and so this is what's the real thing, or the closest, or was it something more than that, right? So was it more political, or was it more doctrinal, or was it more something other than just this kind of simplistic succession thing of who's next after him? Was there more to that, or does that come later? I guess initially, what was that really it? Was it just this disagreement of who's closest to him and who gets to like take on the mantle of sorts after his death?
Yeah, I guess it's all of these questions together, in a sense. So yeah, and to explain really later on, to explain today's events and so on, I think this early period, one doesn't need to overstate it either. I mean, it is the the origin of everything, but it's sort of the way in which it has been evoked in later period, which matters, because there were also many periods when this division actually didn't really matter so much anymore and could be, toned down and people could get along very, very well. But I think sort of the emotional resonance of that early split, for both sides is yeah. I mean, Shia think the Islamic history took a wrong turn at the start, and Sunnis think, well, the Shia they sort of didn't go with the mainstream and sort of deviated from what should be just, they should just accept what happened, because of course, in the early period, the majority of the Muslim community followed the four caliphs and what came to be sort of the Sunni standard norms. And broadly speaking, this has been sort of the pattern, with a few exceptions like the Shi'i century, which I guess we'll talk about later. But I mean, Sunnism has become the majority form of the religion, and so. But yeah, I mean, this early split has extreme emotional resonance, and it does also have a class element or a sort of elite element to it, because some of the Sunni caliphs were from the elite of that Hijazi community there at the time, and some of them initially didn't embrace the prophet's message. So there is a lot of potential there to to look for difference, but at the same time, as I mentioned, Ali is a figure accepted by both, although in slightly different terms. But with he is also, in a sense, the unifying figure of Islam. So he married the Prophet's daughter, and therefore, their offspring are considered. The Prophet didn't have a male heir who survived. The children of Ali and his daughter are considered the family of the Prophet in a narrow sense. And
you're talking about Ali as being super important, but I think maybe one reason of this is the descendants. So obviously I'm as a Westerner, I don't know Arabic, so all of my pronunciation is going to be super terrible. So forgive me. But all of his descendants, al Bayt, they were the ones that kind of carried it on. You explain on the Sunni side is that you had these certain caliphs, the Umayyad caliphs, right? Is this right? And I guess how after his death, maybe there's some unifying, figure of sorts with Ali. But again, how was there, as you move further away from, the Prophet, and then maybe after the death of Ali, did it seem to kind of splinter more? Or did it still kind of seem more of like, well, here's the descendants of Ali, so that's closer, and we just kind of follow along? How did it, as it started to go through the 7th and then 8th century, how was the following, I guess, staying in line with this, or did they continue to splinter?
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning, there were also other sort of groups that had, different ideas, which died out, which we don't know much about, and so on and so forth. And the broad categories of Sunnism and Shiism, and there's a third branch, Kharijism. They started to include people of very different opinions. They became broad movements, but within these movements, there was also a lot of diversity. So eventually, Sunnism started to incorporate three major schools of thought and 4 schools of jurisprudence, although that's it's a bit later. And the Shia, they also have 3 major schools of jurisprudence within Shiism. So 12 Shiism, Ismailism, and Zaydism. And the difference between them is they disagree on the line of imams. So, several successors to Ali and his his children. Eventually there were two major splits, and so they followed a sort of different familial line, and say, they are the important leaders. And Ismailis have a line until today, actually, which they say goes back, their Imam, the Aga Khan today, of the main majority line of Ismailis, is that sort of Imam, officially with a line going back to the Prophet. In the other, especially in 12 Shiism, the line ended with the 12th Imam, who they say disappeared and will return on the day of judgment. That's why they're called 12er Shia. But so, within the two broad movements, Sunnism and Shiism, there was a lot of diversity and a lot of splits within them. And sometimes the rivalries, in those two movements could be as strong as the rivalries between them. So you also have a period when the four Sunni schools of jurisprudence don't get along at all with each other.
So I want to come to the schools of jurisprudence that you're referencing there. But I guess one quick note here is all of this stuff is really important for folks that are believers of Islam, because it's the Holy Prophet, right? It's their main main figurehead. And then also, this is coming from Allah, from God. There's all of the Quran. This stuff has big importance, right? Like this isn't just a guy out in Arabia that had some cool ideas, right? Like this is at the same level. It's obviously a huge religion, right? Like this has all of these splits and how people are doing things. I would imagine has a lot of is pretty consequential, right? Of how to do it, how to follow it. Are we doing this the right way? Are we doing, the will of God or Allah? Are we reading the Quran in the right way? And is it that? It's like big stakes. It's not just some cool ideas. You have your way, I have my way. Like people are putting, really a lot of investment into this. Is that? Am I overstating it or not?
No, this is incredibly important, and that's why it's also, important to be a bit, careful when talking about it or writing about it, not to offend anyone, especially, these are sensitive issues. It's one reason why the footnotes ended up being so long, because sometimes I just wanted to, quickly explain, what are the different views on a fairly simple matter, but then, you need to reference this properly because it's contested. And often contested, from different sides. As I just mentioned, there might be different opinions in Sunnism or in Shiism on a particular matter. It's important to be sort of careful about this. So, one of the main problems, in a sense, that arose in Islam or, in any other religion was that, in the beginning, the word of the Prophet and whatever he did was seen as law. Was seen as, this is the way to do it, and it has to be emulated. And then, after he died, people started to, the first generation of Muslims, they still remembered how he did things or what he said. And what he said would become the Quran would be eventually written down. And one of the important things, for example, is that eventually, actually, Sunnis and Shias agree on the Quran as one text. So historically, there were a lot of polemics that perhaps people would see, that some things had been omitted or so on. But today, all major Sunni and Shia scholars agree on the same text. So it's actually pretty big agreement here. It's also important to note. But then the second, so the two main things, in a sense, that people, Muslims should follow is the Quran and the guidance left by the Prophet through his actions. So that's often called the Sunnah, the tradition. And here is now where there are already diverging opinions, because Shia have a different view of what that tradition is from Sunnis, but the term Sunni comes from this Sunnah, which is that sort of the meaning of this whole body of things that he did or said in his lifetime. And so Islamic law as a discipline starts to form around how to interpret the Quran and the Sunnah to make, to regulate life for Muslims ever after until today. So this is how then the different legal schools become formed. And, for many Muslims, for many centuries, this was incredibly important. And, these rulings, shaped, everything really. I mean, the whole life and the legal system. And it is here that there were pretty strong disagreements between Sunnis and Shia, because Shia said that also the Imams, so the sort of successors of the Prophet, whatever they said and did is also law. So there's a much wider body of precedents and so on that you could choose from, and that eventually led to some different interpretations. So when in sort of Shia ruled states, or in states where both systems were allowed, this happened mainly later under colonialism and so on and so forth, and in the modern period, you have actually differences on inheritance law or divorce or things like that, which can be quite significant. So yeah. Does that make sense, more or less?
It does. It does. I mean, I know this is obviously, again, extremely consequential, and yes, I mean, you're terribly respectful in the book, and so obviously for myself as well, I'll be respectful for people's opinions and belief systems. I guess the question I have here is so we can get to the schools of jurisprudence. So there's the 4 major Sunni schools, and then the 2 major Shia schools, which you had mentioned earlier a little bit. I guess the question here is, so when I think of jurisprudence, I think of like law, like a legal system, right? So this isn't, these aren't necessarily schools of thought, or like, it's not philosophy, it's not wisdom, it's not some type of aphorisms necessary. It's not something like, it's not like a wisdom tradition or philosophy tradition. Like these are rules, these are laws that you have to follow, and the different schools are the different interpretations based on the Quran and the Sunnah of how to do that. Is that like a loose way of explaining that, or am I missing something?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. No, the legal schools, they are there to devise rulings and establish a legal system, and I focus on them quite a lot in the book, because I think they're pretty important at different points in history, including sort of in the early modern and modern periods, when someone dies, actually, now he's being questioned, so which legal school does his estate, for example, become, regulated through? And so this starts to be, something you can't really escape in certain contexts, and then you get sort of ticked, get put in a box, so to speak. But on the schools of thought, there is a lot of overlap also between the different sides. So in philosophy, especially, and sort of reasoning and so on and so forth, there's been a lot of conversation between nominally Sunni and Shia scholars over the centuries, and that's also one of the themes that I pick up at times, that actually in certain areas there's been a lot of influence from the different sides onto each other. That in certain periods was not a problem. Even the legal schools influenced each other. So the Sunni legal schools were sort of earlier in codifying themselves. That influenced strongly the Shia legal schools, because the Shia legal schools for a while had imams still living who could sort of act as guiders. So there was also strong influence there. So I mean, one of the themes of the book is also, influence and shared knowledge and interaction and so on and so forth. So it's not just conflict or divergence. Eventually, I guess it is a story of hardening identity boundaries, over the whole time span. But within that, there was a lot of time for communication and cross-referencing and interaction and so on and so forth, especially in also in non-legal disciplines of knowledge. So you have all these other disciplines, mathematics, as natural sciences, astronomy, and so on and so forth, where people, it never really matters what, which were very important in sort of Islamic societies in the medieval period, where people don't think about, what's that other person's religious background when they cite someone.
So this really does sound like it's more of, as you branch out to other disciplines about maybe the natural world or even metaphysical claims, less importance about the different school, but it's more of, when it comes to the Quran and the Sunnah and understanding certain interpretive aspects of that, that's where it maybe has a more of a sticking point.
The four Sunni schools are the Hanbali, Maliki, Hanafi, and Shafi schools, and on the Sunni side, it's the Ismailis, Zaydis, and 12er Shia. The book sort of looks at the relations between all of them, and as I mentioned, like in later periods. So in the 10th century, 11th century, you have this period that's sometimes been called the Shia century, when especially Ismailis take power in numerous key locations. So the Fatimids start to rule Egypt, and actually much of the southern Mediterranean. It's quite spectacular, really. Including Sicily and much of North Africa, really. And there's a moment where you might say, well, maybe Islamic history goes in a different direction, in a sense that Shiism becomes, perhaps even the majority. But then the Crusades play a big role in putting everything, again in turmoil, and there's constant wars and so on and so forth. And the Ismailis also fight amongst each other. There's a rival Ismaili power based in the Gulf and in Iraq, and they disagree on a relatively minor matter, but doctrinally, but therefore fight each other and sort of lead to each other's downfall. And associated with that, sort of then trying to push the Crusaders out, there's a period sometimes called the Sunni revival. So associated with people like Saladin and so on and so forth, who eventually abolishes the Fatimid empire. So the book problematizes these easy categorizations. On the one hand, we need guidelines to sort of make broad sense of periods. But for example, in the Shia century, there was very little conversion, top-down conversion, and also, in the Sunni century, in the Sunni revival, it wasn't like the Shia populations that did exist were converted to Sunnism or something like that. So in this sort of pre-1500 era, states, it's not like today we understand the state had fairly loose control. Sort of the religious symbolism was largely sort of symbolic, often associated with the capital and sort of state, in a sense, rituals, and there was fairly little mass conversion. And if this conversion happened, it took a very long time. So it was more through, let's say, taxation or tax incentives for believers versus non-believers of whatever was the right creed or the right religion at the moment, but not sort of saying, well, you have to by next week you have to convert, or else something really bad will happen to you. So that, I think, problematizes these broad characterizations.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. It's interesting how you talk about the kind of the Shia kind of century. It's a long time. It's not like it's talking decades and decades and decades, spanning two centuries. I guess in that sense was, it's a different time and there's all these things going on in the world, but in this region there wasn't an emphasis necessarily on how do we spread this and get everybody else to believe Islam necessarily? I mean, was there any type of conversion going on, or was this more of, more regional types of conflicts or domination, or I guess what was the motivations here politically for the Shia or the Sunnis in
No, I
different
mean,
periods?
ultimately, yes, there was mass conversion to Islam. I mean, the story of the first few centuries of the Muslim, expansion and conquest is a conversion to Islam of many, many populations. But again, that happened largely also through, like tax incentives and things like that, or in what's today's Syria and the Levant, for example, it's a process that took several centuries. I have a colleague at Oxford, Christian Sarner, who wrote about this sort of the slow conversion to Islam in the Levant. How did it happen, and so on and so forth. My book looks more at inner Islamic relations. So once people embrace Islam, maybe often it was a very loose understanding of what it meant. One of the arguments that one could make is that this idea that the family of the Prophet, there was some tangible the rituals and so on and so forth. There was also visual depictions at time of the family of the Prophet that was perhaps more easy for people to relate to. So it became a big role in public religiosity, including in newly converted populations. And it wasn't necessarily seen as something Shi or something Sunni. It was just broadly speaking seen as something Muslim, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, on the Crusades piece, I remember reading that in the book, and it seemed like there was a kind of not necessarily unification, but there was a more of I guess a common enemy, right? Where it was like these people are coming over here and they're doing all this stuff, and we might have our own differences, but that's probably more of a threat. The Crusades are what they were doing and how it was. Is that a right characterization or no?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, yes. I mean, in the beginning, the Crusades were seen as just sort of another power. I mean, no one really knew that they were going to, for several centuries, try to, set up a massive settler state around Jerusalem and all the southern Mediterranean coast. I mean, I think local people didn't understand that, and the local powers also didn't understand it. And probably the Crusades themselves didn't really know that they were going to have so many crusades and waste so much resources and energy on this. And so initially there was not that sort of common reaction, and there was quite a lot of sort of they made alliances temporarily with this or that ruler. One of the interesting things somehow is also the undermining this whole Christian Muslim rivalry that's always been going on, is that obviously the Crusades started with a call from the Orthodox patriarch in Constantinople. But then eventually the Orthodox Church was ransacked, and the Catholics, once they had established sort of control, it was absolutely not a Christian solidarity, but in fact Christian sectarian rivalry that also was very powerful here. And also some of the Christian churches that existed in the Levant, once the Crusades were there, they started looking at them more closely and saying, well, actually you're not following the right doctrine, and you have to change, and so on and so forth. So on both sides, I guess there was much more diversity than is commonly assumed. But fundamentally the Crusades were just another period of upheaval, and it definitely helped also undermine sort of, broadly speaking, Sunni rule, sort of the early Sunni caliphates. And this intensified later in the 13th century, when the Mongols start conquering much of the region that we're talking about here, and eventually overthrowing and abolishing the Abbasid Caliphate, which is this other main caliphate that succeeded the Umayyads and played such an important role for several centuries. So you have several times sort of external powers conquering what by then is becoming sort of the core of the Islamic world, and decentralizing religious and political authority. And when that happens, movements that are not, from different perspectives can flourish. And so this, I think, in part explains why so many, different branches survived and strengthened for a long time. And these include the Ismailis and Twelver Shia and the various groups that exist until today in Syria and Lebanon, such as the Druze or the Alawites, and also the Maronites and sort of several, smaller Christian groups that are, don't conform to Catholicism or to, Sunnism.
Yeah, it's just super fascinating how these things persist, how these groups persist for so long. It's just fascinating. So we talk about Muslim empires. So obviously the Ottomans are much talked about. It's almost like this. I find I keep bumping into the Ottoman Empire and everything I'm reading, and I'll talk to people, and it pops up in this history and pops up in this history, and even because it went so long, it's over 600 years, and it was. I had a conversation recently with a historian scholar on Suleiman, who is super fascinating, is super interesting. I think in the 16th century, if I'm right. So I guess just from your perspective, so you have this kind of period where post Crusades, kind of the Mongols are still there, but after this period, and we get into the 14th century, and getting close to 15th and 16th century, where there's that kind of big pivot that a lot of historians discuss. What was it, I guess, about the Ottomans that made them super powerful and influential for Islam? I mean, they have their own kind of way of centralizing power and how they governed at different points, but how did Islam become such a big player here for the Ottoman Empire?
So I guess you immediately pointed to sort of the fundamental, importance of the Ottoman Empire, but also in a sense to the problem of using the term Ottomans as explaining something, because they ruled for so long and over such a vast area, but also at other points it was much smaller, and the kinds of rule of, let's say, the 15th century sort of local chieftaincy to early 20th century industrialized nation state is with a vast army and the navy. I mean, it's just, we're talking about completely different things, which are, because it's the same dynasty, are called Ottomans. So we really need to be, I mean, that's why the Ottomans pop up everywhere, because they're they're so crucial for so many different periods, but we need to disentangle this a little bit. And I mean, Ottomans are very important for this book, obviously. So index entry on the Ottomans is vast. But we need to take it apart a bit, because it really means different things in different periods. So as you mentioned, sort of in the 14th century and sort of after the end of the Abbasid Caliphate, Sufism becomes very, new forms of Sufism emerge that become very popular in very different scenarios, across much of the Eastern Mediterranean, Anatolia, but all the way to India, and various forms of Shiism also, especially sort of popular forms of Shiism become very widespread, and you no longer have necessarily a sort of central Sunni authority that can say, what's right or what's wrong. And so it is sort of and then you have new populations which start to embrace Islam, Turkic speaking populations, and you have a lot of migration and a lot of sort of, because of all these conquests and including, the Mongol conquests, and then their rivalry with the Mamluks, you have, a lot of population movement and and general insecurity, and it is in that sort of wider context that two main movements emerge that have a strong sort of tribal backing, both in sort of Turkic speaking Anatolia, and both have a strong religious element to them. And one are what become later the Ottomans, and the others are the Safavids. The Safavids themselves are actually originally a Sufi order, but where the leadership is sort of passed down in the Safavid family of the order, but that takes on also the form of sort of a social political movement with the eventual aim to founding a state. And in the beginning, the Ottomans and the Safavids are actually very close, including personally close, and help each other out. So this is, including up until the 15th century. But the Ottomans then established sort of, principality in what's now Turkey, and eventually expand their power there. And the Safavids expand their power in northern Iran. And in 1501, they famously take over Iran as a whole, and establish Shiism as Twelver Shiism as the state religion there. It is sort of from then on that especially the Ottomans and the Safavids fall out very strongly. And one of the reasons for their fallout is not just sort of a different interpretation of religion, but it's also that they actually compete for the allegiance of similar populations in what becomes the borderland between the Iran and Turkey and Ottoman Turkey, sort of Anatolia. And there, much of the population actually embraces a sort of, broadly speaking, the family of the Prophet Islam that has some Shia overtones, but perhaps would perhaps also be classified as Sunni. It's sort of a little bit of a mix of things, and it's only sort of when the two sides start to form their own states that it becomes more normatively associated with either or, and that from then on you have sort of sectarianization in a sense from the top of these populations, and trying to draw them to either side or the other. And then very quickly the two sides are at war with each other, precisely for this reason, because the Ottomans say, well, some of the populations that should be our citizens, or well, not citizens, but subjects, are actually now fighting for the Safavids. So this is undermining our sovereignty. So we have to, fight a war against them. And the Safavid also have more territorial ambitions. So this starts a period where you have sort of two major states fighting each other for, very long time. And both sides invoke religious arguments to legitimize this. So there's sort of, the clerics issue fatwas saying, well, the others are unbelievers and we have to fight them. And this is something new. It's something that hadn't happened really before, especially that you have, Sunni and Shia powers saying that sort of against each other.
It's interesting, especially because I go to northern Iran, and the Safavids, you talk about how during that period there was some coinciding with the consolidation of Persian culture in Iran. Can you talk about this I don't know, mixture of sorts of Safavids with Persians? Obviously Persia is a very long ancient civilization, and it persists, but how did at this period the Safavids and the Persians kind of mix, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, so when Islam first spread to Iran, again, it took quite a while for the majority of the population to convert, and they initially converted to Sunnism. And so actually some of the founders of the Sunni legal schools are originally, Persian speakers. And you have actually in that period, you have a lot of foundational work even of Sunnism are written in Persian. So it's very interesting actually. But from the Safavid conversion on, and that was actually the first time where you had a sort of enforced conversion in a sense. So the Safavids appointed Friday prayer leaders across the whole country, and they had this famous group of enforcers that would roam the streets and well, Sunnis and Shias go to the mosque at different times of the day, for example, pray slightly differently, would just make sure that people actually do everything according to the Shii way, and people could get beaten up or killed or expelled from the country if they didn't conform. So this, I think, is a break in a sense with what had happened before. And then over time, I mean, the Safavid Empire is also economically successful relatively in the 16th century and afterwards, and so Iranian culture changes and starts to contain a very strong Shia element, and in the rituals there's also a lot of sort of cultural fusion and so on and so forth. But they develop a sort of also a body of public songs and literature to be read out, and visual culture associated with Iranian Shiism that is understandable for the masses, and so on and so forth. Things that didn't exist before. So it's from that moment on that Iran becomes strongly associated with Shiism, which it is until today. But I mean, again, one of the things I show in the book is that this is only sort of half the story. I mean, all the prehistory of the Islamic world, Shiism was, most of the early figures were Arab, and Shiism played a pretty important role in sort of Arab history, or Arab Muslim history, Arabic speaking populations before this sort of conversion of Iran.
So this I believe this is this kind of reference to the Twelver Shiism becoming institutionalized in Iran. It's this process,
Yes.
and I guess specifically, I mean, what is it? Is it not only just there was some obviously precursors there, as you were talking about, with some of these things were already written from one of the schools in the kind of Persian language, but was it also this kind of at the time during this period of conflict with the Ottomans and then having their own sort of kind of empire? I guess the question I have is how did it become so institutionalized in Iran that we still see as dominant today? I mean, we're talking 600-700 years. It didn't break. It's persisted, I guess. Obviously, of course, it's not this majority. I'm sure there's minorities for sure that are less big. But what is it, I guess, that has that holding power, I guess, that you think? Is it something about this period or this conflict, or is it something else?
I mean, on the one hand, the Safavids themselves had a sort of special charisma, especially the early founders, and they were seen as Sufi leaders, and those who followed them, they really saw them as, more than just political figures. I mean, even, very important religious leaders. Then, as I mentioned, they sort of fused Shiism with Persian rituals, I guess, and culture, and especially language. And lastly, I mean, this was a new form of state. This was a different state from a few centuries ago, and it had completely different ambitions. It's also a state that is engaged in early modern diplomacy. You have sort of, in Europe, very similar processes going on with now Protestant and Catholic states sort of rivaling each other and trying to seal alliances with their relative enemies. So you have European powers reaching out to the Ottomans, but especially also to the Safavids, against the Ottomans, and so on and so forth. So it's a new kind of state. It has more resources, and I mean, they were very committed believers also, and they also appointed clerics to oversee that sort of enforcement. So the Safavids invited many Arab Shia clerics from Lebanon or Bahrain, for example, or Iraq, where Shiism had survived over the centuries, but had been fairly marginal, to come and work as Grand Mufti or administrator in the provinces to establish this sort of conversion. So And on the other hand, the Ottomans did the same. I mean, they eventually established new teaching institutions for the clergy, and recruited hundreds of clerics to work across the empire and promote a sort of Ottoman Sunnism.
Mm,
But they did not, let's say, in the provinces, especially in Anatolia and so on, they knew that many of the populations did not necessarily subscribe to that ideal. They were, in general, more lenient with allowing that to continue, unless people sort of very openly challenged sort of state Sunnism.
mm,
But in general, yeah, we're dealing with sort of a new kind of state. These early modern empires that become quite committed to institutionalizing a particular form of confessional identity.
mm,
Another case are sort of the Uzbeks, the Shaybanid Uzbeks in today's Uzbekistan, Central Asia,
mhm,
and then the various dynasties on the Indian subcontinent. The Mughals, the most famous of them, they're originally also from a pretty strong Sunni background. But in their reign, they have so many different religious groups under their control. Most are non-Muslim, that they don't enforce one interpretation so strongly.
mm,
But on the Indian subcontinent, then you have various smaller dynasties who embrace 12 Shiism very strongly.
mm,
And they do that in part to differentiate themselves from the Mughals.
mm,
So you always have also embracing now, you can, for like, let's say a provincial Muslim ruler who has some, financial means and has some military political means, embracing a different confession is now also a way of becoming an independent ruler, which
mm,
means keeping your tax revenues, and you can make international alliances, including with emerging European powers, the British East India Company, or early traders, the Portuguese, and so on and so
mhm,
forth. So for many, it's actually quite a convenient way of not having to pay sort of allegiance, for example, to the Ottomans or the Mughals, who say, we're the caliphate on earth. You can't have you can only be our vassal, but you can't be an independent, truly
mm,
independent power. So embracing, for example, Shiism becomes a way of saying no, we can be independent. So the Safavids definitely do that. There's a bit of an element where the Safavids sort of think that the other Shia rulers in India should be subservient to them, and some of them are actually inspired by the Safavids to also try to sort of convert their populations to Shiism. But ultimately, the Indians are doing quite their own thing.
mm, mhm,
But so you see, the Safavid, and Ottoman rivalry has a very strong impact also quite far away, and in
mhm.
India leaves lasting legacies that become important, once the British enter more strongly in the 18th century.
Mhm. I'm gonna come to India in a minute, but I guess my big takeaways in looking at the Mongols, over the steppe, looking at the Ottomans, looking at the Safavids, looking at all these big empires in this period is really fascinating to me about how these empires were using obviously trade, various elements of economics, religion. There is a conquering element. But I think this idea of governing with all of these different people groups, all of these different kinds of
Yeah,
places, how you have like a a centralized way or an institutionalized way of governing all of that and having allowing the space where and again this is I mean, even in some of these, I think it was, before domestication of horses. Of course, I think at this period that we're there, but I mean, traveling was still very much tough. And so, this idea of how you have these very localized kinds of communities throughout a massive part of Central Eurasia, and obviously some of the Mediterranean, and the current Mid East. It just blows my mind how these places were able to do this. Like these empires were able to do it, and for a long time over some pretty treacherous terrain. It's very. I think there's for me when I hear all of these histories, it's a reminder of how humans are not really that different from today, different times and different things going on. But this idea of how they were able to do that, and how in some ways maybe because things were simpler in one way and not in another, in some ways maybe there's so many things we can learn from how people were able to govern. Of course there is lots of raping and pillaging and devastation and war and killing, but it's interesting, I guess, when you think about it from a systems perspective, how this was happening with these dueling factions of sorts. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very important observation. So they could never be too strict, right? Because it wouldn't have worked.
Right, right.
Because populations were very diverse. I mean, and these empires ruled vast territories, and they didn't yet have, what the modern state had, with such rapid communications and much more, well, I mean, they had, of course, spy networks and of course, and so on and so forth. I mean, they did know to a certain extent what went on, but it was not, it's not, comparable to today. And so therefore, a lot of it was also ruling through being a little bit ambiguous in a sense. So if you knew there was a prosperous community, but they, in their mosques or in their houses of worship, they did a bit something different from what was officially the norm. In general, they were left alone. But what happened sometimes is that someone would walk into the grand mosque of whatever state and claim the ruler, the sultan, or the caliph, or the leader was a complete idiot and actually was all wrong. Then you could be executed for something like that. And sort of in the historical record, we have to be very careful. You have such instances of religious persecution, but relatively speaking, there was quite far apart, or if it happened, it often coincided, let's say, with a major war. But then a few years later, these populations will be left alone again, or states were quite good at or just taxing them a bit more and making sort of money that way. And so we don't necessarily want to overemphasize this polarization, but at the same time, it went on for several centuries, and it shaped the Ottoman self-understanding. Definitely becomes one of the defenders of Sunnism. So the Ottomans have this long rivalry with the Habsburgs in Europe. And in that process they try to portray themselves much more as sort of Muslim rulers. And then, in the challenge with the Safavids, they become sort of Sunni Muslim rulers, So, and that becomes part of the raison d'etat and so on, and has an impact later on. And so it is consequential, but we're not yet talking about sort of the modern state. And that's why, the book is sort of split up in 4 sections. The first on this earlier period, the second on these empires that we're talking about now, from about 1500 to 1750, 1800. And then the third part on the modern state, which comes in the form initially mainly of colonial organization, and in an Ottoman state that is modernizing and embracing European forms of statehood, especially in the 19th century.
You mentioned the book. It's not fleshed out a lot, but I guess I want to just ask if it's important about the rise of Wahaabism in the Arabian Peninsula. How we mentioned India a little bit, and kind of the spread to India, and India will probably become more of a player in the modern state. But with Wahhabis, I guess, what's the role they play there during this kind of state and between 15 and 1800? What is their rise, and then how that kind of comes on the scene?
Yeah, no, I mean, the Wahhabi movement is incredibly important for so many reasons, but especially here for this uh, adversity towards Shiism and the way this really influenced Sunni-Shia relations ever since the Wahhabis emerged.
Mm.
And so the Wahhabis emerge in the mid-18th century on the Arabian Peninsula. There's a cleric called Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, and he comes from a small town in Najd in the center of the Arabian Peninsula, today Saudi Arabia. And from a sort of a branch of the Hanbali school, one of these four Sunni schools of jurisprudence, that had been the most anti-Shia of all of them. So it's in that school that sort of the early polemics are written. But the Ottoman Empire, for example, the state school is Hanafism. So it's not as strongly anti-Shi, despite all that rivalry with the Safavids, like in legal terms. But the Hanbalis, for them, really Shiism is absolute no-go. It's I mean, they're outside of Islam basically.
Mm.
And so when Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab goes on his sort of study tour, one of the things about the Arabian Peninsula and also modern Saudi Arabia is that few people know, and also the Gulf region, is that it's actually incredibly religiously diverse, much more so than what we think of, today about Saudi Arabia, Sunni, Iran, Shia, and I mean, I already problematized that a bit in Iran, and you actually still have Sunni populations in Iran that didn't convert in that Safavid era. But also on the Arabian Peninsula, you have pretty big Shia populations, especially in the eastern province and in Bahrain and in Kuwait and Basra, sort of southern Iraq anyway. So he goes and travels and meets all of these people in these places and becomes sort of revolted with what are their religious practices and so on and so forth, and authors sort of strong polemic against them. And he then makes this alliance with an early Saudi local ruler, and that's sort of mythologically that's the origin of the Saudi Wahhabi alliance, and that later would lead to modern Saudi Arabia. And Wahhabism for a very long time was actually sort of state doctrine in Saudi Arabia until a few years ago, and so played a very important role. And that anti-Shiism, was sort of its, one of its key elements, and that really problematized relations both with the Shia inside Saudi Arabia, but also, across the whole region, and especially that notion that Shia and others, including some Sufis and so on, are actually outside of Islam, so they don't have protections under Islamic law at all. So, which means in the most extreme case, they can be killed.
Wow.
So when you have these in the last 2 decades, you have suicide attacks on and other attacks on Shia mosques and so on. This school of thought is invoked to legitimize that, and so it's been very, it's been very, it has a very heavy legacy. But it's important here because it emerges in the 18th century, and then it's just about the time when also European powers start to sort of become much more involved. And Wahhabi, the general sort of Sunni revivalism that Wahhabism is a part of, become also one way in which to try to resist sort of British, especially British encroachment. And so I have a chapter on sort of Muslim revivalisms in the book. And then there is, of course, also a Shia reaction to this very strong Sunni anti-Shia revivalism. And you see that in sort of more self-consciously Shia clerics and rulers in the 19th century. But yeah, the Wahhabis are very important. And I mean, I discussed them at length in the book.
Yeah. So in as we have the empires developing or ruling, I guess, in the 18 and 1900s, obviously you have the British rule in India. So I could just chat about a little bit. What was the way in which the British organized and managed various divisions of Islam within India? It's very, very fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, this British period was really crucial. So I think we laid the foundations here now to really pick up all those pieces. So one of the things I look at is law. So how the British sort of institutionalized for the first time, really, these legal divisions in a written way. So all of these empires or states and rulers that we talked about, generally speaking, they allowed only one legal school,
Mm,
in in whatever they thought was the right one.
mm,
Now, very broadly speaking. So, in the Ottoman Empire, it was only allowed to be ruled according to Hanafi Sunnism, and then in Safavid Iran, it was the 12 Shi school.
mhm,
So, it wasn't possible to pick and choose. So, it was just this was just the law for Muslims. Then
mm.
sometimes there were exceptions for Christians and Jews or other religious groups, but broadly speaking, if you're a Muslim, whatever the dominant legal school of the state is, that's will be applied to you. But what the British did now for the first time in India, starting in the late 18th century, so the East India Company, because it actually started taking control of populations where some of these Shi rulers that I had mentioned before, um, ruled actually over very wealthy states, and these were some of the states the East India Company first took possession of or started to have strong influence in. So they wanted to have a legal system that they could use for these diverse populations, and then there was a sort of relationship between some of the ways in which some of these officials and judges were trained. Some of them were trained in the Orientalist tradition that was emerging in the universities back in England at the time. So, to study the religion and culture sort of the Orient. And in that vein, they said, well, there's Sunnis and Shias, and they're also, so we have to have a different legal system for both of them. And especially if the ruling families were Shia and some of the large merchants were Shia, this was actually quite important for them. So they started writing legal codes where these transactions and inheritance and so on were codified according to whatever school you personally embraced. So when you went to the judge, you had to say what you were. And they started publishing books based on this. And then eventually, they also started doing censuses where they asked people, so what is your religion? And then what is your sect underneath that? And that was a completely new phenomenon. It had never really happened. The Ottomans would never have done something like that, and never did ever after. So they always even until the early 20th century, they always said, well, Muslims is just Muslims, there's no sect or something like, you couldn't say, well, I'm a Shia Muslim, I want to be treated differently in court or something like that. So what the British did there was transformative, and I think really had a very strong impact, because they also then started implementing this in different parts of the empire. And, eventually, after the First World War, they obviously had the British mandate for Iraq, which created Iraq as a modern state, and they're also saw Sunni Shi as two completely different categories, politically and legally speaking, and which basically set up Iraq the way it is today, and created a lot of these problems that we saw afterwards. So I think one can trace back quite a lot of this stuff to British India.
So let me get this straight. I remember reading some of this in the book, and it was hard to. I never thought of it this way, so it was wrapping my head around it. You had the monarchy, the British Empire in India, systematizing laws for big groups of a religion that's not their own.
Yes. I mean, the British Empire ruled over half the world, so it came up with all sorts of things. I mean, the whole question of caste is the more famous one in India. That the British, some say, invented caste, or others said formalized it, because caste was also something you could put on the census, or you were asked which caste you were, and some of these things were not really used in that way before, or were unspoken, or some people didn't really know. I mean, in the case of the Muslims, yes, And the first census, many didn't tick a sectarian box. So then there was an internal investigation. Why didn't that happen? So the next census, the officials were asked to see how people pray and then tick the box for them. So, there was definitely such a process where in relationship with the state, sectarian identity became stronger. In some cases, was even created for certain groups. There were some small groups which had, were sort of a mix between Hinduism and Islam, and in certain practices were more like that, and the others like that. They, and the officials just said, well, that's not possible. We need to fit you in one of these categories, also for inheritance and so on and so forth. Because the empires, they always, they claimed they were working sort of within the law once they had conquered the land. The rule of law was officially, one of the benefits of the empire. And so inheritance and divorce and so on so personal status law were actually quite important aspect of this whole thing. And it's personal status law where these divisions are the strongest between the different Muslim groups.
It's so fascinating. That is so fascinating. Okay, so I guess about the Ottomans then. So we talked a lot about them, the Ottoman Empire and all that. But I guess you had mentioned it earlier, this kind of modernization that they were doing in the 19th century. So they had a lot of features in place at different points, 16th, 17th, 18th century. But as we get to 1800s, 1900s, how did they kind of reorganize things, and this continued interaction with Iran and what was going on there?
Yeah, so I think we talked about that quite a bit, and then what's going on the other side is sort of that the relationship with Europe and just the development that the European powers start to become so strong economically and start to also eat away, in a sense, territory from the Ottoman Empire, and so the Ottomans become financially indebted more and more to European powers, and one of the ways in which this influence in the empire was expanding was through protection of religious communities. So the Christians and Jews in the Ottoman Empire, some were very large and old communities, started to have sort of foreign patrons, and some of these developments dated back longer, but in other cases, this sort of intensified in the 19th century, and so the European states also negotiated exemption of their citizens from local jurisdiction or something. So if you had a dispute in a provincial Ottoman town, or and you were a Swede, you killed someone, that you wouldn't, be hanged there, or so. But the same then started to be expanded dramatically by trying to include religious communities wholesale under this sort of protection agreement, and then an additional factor here were sort of missionaries who started to operate across the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottomans at that point were still, controlling Jerusalem. So a lot of Christian missionaries, were obviously drawn to that and wanted to, convert, especially the Middle Eastern Christians who had their own churches, but then also started to be interested in the non-Sunni Muslims of the empire, because they realized, well, the Sunnis are those who strongly identify with the state, and with Sunni Islam are very hard to convert, basically didn't work. And then those who are, fully 12 Shia, they don't really, they don't buy any of these, missionary activity. But they hoped that a lot of these communities that I had mentioned before, like the Druze, the Alawites, who were sort of a bit also at the margins of Sunnism and Shiism, and some of them didn't have a written legal tradition or even a written sort of religious tradition. They would be more easier to convert, and they could also perhaps be protected by a European power in return for. So if you converted, you sometimes actually got that sort of foreign protection, which was useful for business and personal reasons. So in the 19th century, had a sort of the Ottoman state saw this as an erosion of their jurisdiction and of their sovereignty, and frankly, it was interfering in the domestic affairs of the Ottoman Empire through that avenue of religion and religious sort of protection of religious communities. And it's sort of in that context that a lot of the religious political tension and also violence of the last century of the Ottoman Empire sort of develops, and where you can sort of see the foundation for that. And there are a couple of pogroms in that period, and eventually very strong violence also. And but it's in that context of sort of increasing European colonial penetration, really, of the Ottoman Empire, and then the state trying to strengthen its hold also on these communities. At times it tries to appease them, and then at other times it starts to say, well, no, actually we have to strengthen the Sunni identity of all of these Muslims and really undermine Shiism and undermine these smaller trends by forcing them to be educated in proper Sunnism, and that's the only way to go. But sort of religion becomes the contested battlefield, if you like, of great power politics in that period.
Yeah, well, I mean, all of that kind of leads us to the 20th century, and so you talk about this in the book. Obviously, is that there's attempts at pan-Islam revivals, pan-nationalisms, but we get to this world of nationalism. And there's two bits here that are maybe as examples. Maybe you could talk about the rise of Baathism and how this took foothold in Syria and in Iraq. That's some people may be familiar with that. And then how it was a little bit different in Turkey, which they had abolished the caliphate and became a little bit more secular, at least at the time, if I got this right. So just talk about how there was this, like, in the modern state, which we kind of see in 20th century and stuff, a lot of nationalism and things of that nature, and yes, there's kind of ways in which religion is kind of used in certain ways, and talk about how we got to a little bit more of how things are in the 20th century.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways in which the Ottomans in the last decades actually wanted to resist this sort of European encroachment and try to regain a sort of new meaning for themselves was through pan-Islam. So you had Sultan Abdul Hamid the second, who ruled from the, I think, 1870s until the early 20th century, and he sort of became a leading figure of pan-Islam, and actually wanted to also bring the Shia into a sort of pan-Islamic front against colonialism and against the British and the French especially. And that idea was actually quite, became very powerful in India, where people even some Shia, many Shia, in fact, started to see the Ottoman Empire as a sort of, one of the last, because India had been colonized, a century before. So the Ottomans still were nominally independent, although indebted financially and with all those caveats that I mentioned, but, they were still nominally independent. And they still claimed to be the caliph. So there was the caliphate became for a while actually a sort of pan-Islamic institution of Muslim sovereignty that was seen as outside of colonial control and to protect it at all costs. So in the First World War, when the Ottomans join the war on Germany's side, and it's actually German Orientalists invent this idea that the Ottoman Caliph should call for a jihad, which he then does, and a lot of Indian Shia and Sunnis actually support this idea and collect money and resources for the Ottoman war effort. To try and protect the Ottoman Caliphate, but obviously the First World War, the Ottoman Empire is on the losing side, and it's really the final sort of blow to the empire. The last remaining provinces outside of core Turkey are lost, I mean, it's it's the age of nationalism is starting, and both in Turkey and in all those provinces who claim, to become independent, to fulfill their national destinies, and so on and so forth. And sort of the more the empire shrinks, the more it also becomes, the less religiously and ethnically diverse it becomes. I mean, before, especially in the Balkans, it was very diverse, and in Greece, I mean, it was very diverse populations and very large Christian populations. So for a while, the Ottoman Empire is also a huge Christian empire in a sense. But that becomes reduced, and the definition of the state becomes much more narrower, and sort of Turkish nationalism becomes a very important factor. And in the Turkish War of Independence, as it's called, Ataturk obviously becomes sort of the foundational figure, a military leader in this regard. And in a really ironic twist, the caliph and the Ottoman family, the Sultan's family, becomes seen as remnants sort of the old order that didn't work. And what few people know, and it's really ironic also in a sense, for the story of this book, is that as I mentioned, in India, the caliphate remained popular much longer and perhaps wider than in Turkey itself. So when the Turkish nationalists are debating whether to abolish the caliphate, the Aga Khan at the time, so the leader of the Ismailis and a very senior Twelveshi politician from India, they write a letter to the Turks to say, please don't abolish the caliphate. It's we're supporting it. It's in the 1920s, and then that letter by two Shia figures from India is actually used as the final straw. So by the Turkish nationalists saying, well, the caliphate has become an avenue for foreign interference, and we can't have it. And anyway, it's sort of pre-modern, and we want to get rid of all of that. And so this letter is in effect then used as the final sort of argument for abolishing the caliphate, which is, I mean, super ironic in a sense, and also shows that there were many periods when the Sunni Shia fault line was not the dominant one, but at the same time it was woven into new struggles or into new fault lines.
This is so fascinating. Yeah, I remember reading that in the book, and it's really, really interesting, especially now with how we know Turkey today, and they just had a election recently, and there's just so many things going on. It's very fascinating.
Yeah, and I mean, you asked me about nationalism, and the recent Turkish elections, I mean, actually symbolize this again. That of course, nationalism in all those countries, officially, in almost none of them is officially religious in a sense. I mean, Saudi Arabia might be one of the few exceptions. In Saudi Arabia, actually, state identity is so close related to Sunni Wahaabism, and there isn't much else, and it's very obvious, and But in the other states, nationalism is often portrayed as sort of inclusive for people of that ethnicity, right? So it's the language that counts, and so not so much the religion. And in the Turkish case, you have actually quite a lot of the early nationalists are non-Sunnis, especially many are Alevis, sort of, and their religious tradition comes in many ways out of that borderland that I talked about before between the Ottomans and the Safavids, sort of religious tradition that lies sort of a little bit at the borders between the two, and perhaps also other religions. And this is tacitly accepted in a sense, but it's not talked about very openly. But so given that then the new state is meant to be secular and so on, that is not considered a problem. But from the 1950s already onwards, you have a pretty strong sort of Islamic turn in Turkey, and parts of the state and also parts of the political discourse become very strongly associated with Sunnism again, and also with Sunni revivalism. And now in this most recent election, it's really the question of Turkish nationalism and sectarian identity is being
Mm-hmm.
brought to the fore again. I mean, maybe you have seen this, but it was for the first time, I think the opposition leader openly on Twitter said that he was an Alevi. It became made a video to that regard. It became the most watched video in the history of Twitter, which shows you the relevance and in a sense the explosiveness of this. It was really something that everyone wanted to see because it was so unprecedented. And then, okay, some of the people who are allied with the opposition list, they said that's great. And also, but Erdogan, quite strongly said, well, this is, not really the way we should talk about these things, but very strongly played to his Sunni base. And so, yeah, I mean, these questions sort of at the heart of Turkish nationalism and the modern Turkish state are constantly being renegotiated in Turkey, but also in the other countries that we talk about. And actually everywhere. I mean, religion and nationalism is a topic that is of relevance in every country. And almost everywhere you have a sort of more dominant religious tradition that is woven into the symbols of nationalism, perhaps implicitly, but at moments of crisis, this can come to the fore and become a more problematic issue again, and others people can completely forget about it and not worry about them.
I find the history of the Ottomans, but of Turkey, and it's just deeply fascinating. So many twists and turns, and I've been following the election a little bit closely, so it's been really fascinating. Just real quick, because I want to get to the Iranian Revolution '79, kind of more present or more recently. But just real quick about Baathism, because I think that comes up later. How did, just real quick snapshot, how did that rise and kind of take hold in Syria and Iraq?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking great questions. Some of them take longer than pretty long to answer. I mean, Baathism, one of the things, I think we can now extend what we just said about Turkey. We can extend that to Arab nationalism as a whole, but also to Iranian nationalism or Iranian politics, in the sense that per se, Arab nationalism, for example, many of the early ideologues of Arab nationalism in the 19th century were actually Christian Arabic speakers. There were some important Alawites as well, and some Shi'i figures, and of the Arabic-speaking populations, especially in Syria, Lebanon and Iraq. I mean, many of them are not Sunni. So, if you wanted to succeed in this region as an Arab nationalist movement, you had to be inclusive. But at the same time, many of the symbols that Arab nationalism sort of espoused was, for example, the Umayyad Caliphate, which was, based in Damascus, the Abbasid Caliphate that we had talked about before. And, it was really the founders of the Umayyad Caliphate were the ones that fought against the Shi'i imams and so on and so forth. It's the first civil war that we had talked about at the very beginning of the thing. And so by embracing these as role models and as sort of as a golden period of Arabs and Islam, this is the period that Shia feel they were wrong. So, the Christian Arab nationalists said, well, this is, Islam is part of the Arab heritage. So that was one way in which Christian Arab nationalists absorbed, Arab Muslim history. But sort of Shia Arab nationalists, I think, have always been in a bit of a difficult position, and we're more or less just told, to sort of absorb. To acknowledge that well, many of the early caliphates they expanded the territory of Islam and were very successful in some ways, even if they were sort of working against the early Shia. I think we can't go into all the details here. I mean, obviously the Syrian and the Iraqi Baath developed completely differently, and although they have the same sort of ideological origin, in the sense, I mean, eventually also their support bases become completely different. And the Syrian Baath party and the Syrian regime, I mean, obviously, the last decade now, I mean, fought a war with much of its population, and the core support for the regime came from non-Sunni populations, whereas in Iraq it was more or less the opposite around, and the two obviously also didn't get along anymore. But so it's just to say, nationalism can be formed in different ways, and is a discursive tradition that symbols can shift. But Arab nationalism, I mean, is incredibly important, and I discuss in the book, at length how Arab nationalism becomes, in many contexts, largely associated with sort of a Sunni view of history, but then in others, like in the Syrian Baath Party, what are the reasons that the sort of non-Sunnis become so prominent in the Baath Party? And in Syria, this has a lot to do with the French mandate. At the time of the interwar period between the First and the Second World Wars, the French get the mandate for Lebanon and Syria, and the British for Iraq and Palestine and Transjordan. And in those mandates, you really have sort of the institutionalization of sectarian and ethnic difference is a crucial thing. And the French also especially work with sort of minority populations, and they have a policy actually of supporting minority populations. And it's somewhere there that the origins lie of sort of the Baath Party's rise. And I explain this in the book in more detail. In Iran, you have a sort of similar debate like in Turkey. So the early Pahlavi monarchy, which overthrows the Qajar dynasty, the Qajars had actually strongly supported Shiism in a sort of actually Shia revivalism in some ways or another. And the Pahlavis, they were more inspired sort of by what Ataturk was doing, sort of language reform, trying to take Arabic out of the Persian language, and go back to a sort of ancient Iranian tradition. And it's often seen that this was very strongly related to what was going on in Turkey. But at the same time, I think Shiism had already become such an important part of Iranian nationalism by that time, or just of self-understanding and of sort of popular religiosity, and what people thought was sort of their culture, that it never really went away. And so the Iranian Revolution is seen as a sort of a backlash, I guess, against the Pahlavi policies. But there's also some revisionist scholarship on sort of Pahlavi Iran and how they actually also supported religion to a certain extent. But definitely the revolution was a break, because you had a Shi'i cleric, who wrote a sort of manifesto for a modern state, being established according to Islamic norms, a modern Islamic state, and then, took over power and implemented that in the Islamic Republic. So it's a really, it's a radical shift. But one that, if you look at the history both of Shiism and of Iran, you can explain actually why that happened.
Yeah, it feels like a big pivotal moment. Maybe I mean, this was just before I was born, so I don't remember it experientially, but it's definitely in recent history, and it feels like a big moment for obviously for Iran, but I think for the region and I think on the world stage. So now we'll be in more modern times. So obviously there's plenty of things to get here. So big stuff that I want to ask is, we hear a lot about the Muslim Brotherhood. How, again, a lot to say about that. But so as much or as little as you want to say about it. But how did they kind of arrive on the scene, and how are they so influential in many Muslim majority countries?
Yeah, I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood emerged in Egypt, sort of while the British were also still in Egypt in the 1920s, and emerged as a sort of rebellion in some ways against British control, but also benefited from a lot of the infrastructure, so the publishing facilities, networks, and so on, that sort of the early 20th century allowed them. And they come out of this sort of both pan-Islamic tradition and the sort of Sunni revivalist tradition that I mentioned before. And they organized from the beginning as a sort of modern political party, with sort of structure and as a sort of mass movement. And they spread pretty quickly across the Muslim world, and they have actually pretty different trajectories depending on which country we're sort of looking at. But as I mentioned initially, they definitely become they embrace pan-Islam, so they actually don't see in general Shiism as their main enemy or something. They are anti-communist, and they're sort of anti-left in many contexts, and they're sort of anti-colonial, at least sort of in the anti-British context. And in Egypt, at the time when they emerge, the Sunni Shia issue doesn't play a role in Egypt at that time. And there's very small Shia populations. It's not politically relevant. So for the founders and the original ideologues of the Muslim Brotherhood, Shiism is not a topic that they write about or are interested in. But as the Muslim Brotherhood spreads to places like Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, and also then starts to make an alliance with the early Saudi state. So from the 1930s, 40s onwards, the Muslim Brothers encourage people to go more on pilgrimage to Saudi Arabia, and starts to see the Saudi state as sort of the closest in the Sunni world to an Islamic state. And also a state that has major resources and that wasn't colonized, so more authentic, than the other states that were properly colonized. And so they start to have this alliance with the Saudis, and in Saudi sort of have therefore a new generation of Muslim brothers that are also sort of influenced by the Wahhabi tradition. And it is there that sort of a more anti-Shia element enters the Muslim Brotherhood and starts to have quite a strong impact in those states where Sunnis and Shias live side by side. And that's especially Saudi Arabia, but also Lebanon and Syria and Iraq. And in those contexts, the Muslim Brotherhood starts to become pretty sectarian in that sense. So pretty Sunni and against the other groups, or other Muslim groups. And in Syria, this has eventually very strong consequences.
So three kind of bigger topics here that we can kind of end on, because it's more of a again close to essentially present day. So United States obviously has had misadventures in the Mideast. We've had the war on terror. We were in Afghanistan or in Iraq. I don't know what we're doing in Yemen, if anything. There's been all of these times that we've been in the Mideast, but in terms of the war on terror, so with Iraq and Saddam Hussein and all that stuff. I guess so obviously at current, the United States is a big world power, and there's other big world powers as well. I guess, is there just like there's a lot of good people that work obviously in the United States government and stuff, and there's a lot of bad people that work there. But is there like a really big gap or like an ignorance or misunderstanding of the region about Sunni and Shia and all of the different ways and the histories of these things? I mean, is there, I guess, at a leadership level, I'm sure there's people that work in various departments of state that know this stuff and that's their area, but at a leadership level, though, various administrations, is there just an ignorance of not fully capturing what's going on, how there should or shouldn't be involvement? Just I guess, what are your thoughts, I guess, on this the war on terror and how we were in Iraq and all that?
Yeah, I mean, the United States really emerges as the dominant player in the Middle East and the Islamic world in the Cold War. I mean, right after the end of the Second World War. And then for about 2 decades, there's still a lot of British involvement, 2-3 decades. But ultimately, the United States take over all these military bases in the Gulf and elsewhere. And I mean, the Cold War shapes all the policy towards the Islamic world, and you have actually quite a strong alliance between the United States and Muslim actors in that regard, and something I want to work on in the future. So, for example, strong cooperation with the Muslim Brotherhood and with Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth, but also with Pahlavi Iran. I mean, Iran is perhaps the most important ally of the United States, broadly speaking, in the Muslim world. It's at the center of everything, perhaps together with Turkey. So, you can't say it's, it's one side or, or the other, but the United States is completely shocked by the Iranian Revolution. And then you obviously have that, the hostage taking. And, initially the Americans, there are calls for the Americans to sort of support the Shah, support a military coup or a military regime to put down the revolution, and this is actually not approved at the government level. So it's quite interesting actually that this did not happen, because usually in the Cold War, if such a strong ally was threatened, there was actually a military intervention, or I mean, it could have happened, but it did not happen. And then so it's from then on that you see, in 1979, you have actually all this American government correspondence which say, well, what about this Shiism? What is this really? We thought this was, these were sort of quietist clerics, and they were sort of anti-communist and just sat in their houses and were being nice. And now they're sort of doing this massive revolution and becoming really a hub of anti-Western revolutionaries from all across the world. I mean, for a while, Iran became a sort of mecca of revolution, if you like. So there's a lot of misunderstanding already at that time. And then U.S. policy towards the region until today is really misguided for that reason, that it's directed towards containing Iran. Shifting between attempts at regime change and containing Iran, the Iranian Revolution. And so you don't have a sort of a balanced policy. You have this strong support for Israel, this attempt to contain Iran, and then this the aim to protect the oil resources and recycle as much of the oil surplus as possible into dollar economy and into the United States and Europe and elsewhere. So it's not a balanced approach, and that's sort of from before the more recent military interventions started. I mean, one of the main problems was, in a sense, that Saddam Hussein and Iraq, obviously, were not involved in 9/11. So, but they were in, Iraq was invaded. Officially we were given because of 9/11. So there's no, this was obviously a tremendous mistake in so many ways, and shaped, is responsible for a lot of the chaos and the violence and the bloodshed in the last 2 decades. The book, I show that one of the main problems was that the United States then very quickly falls back on sort of what the British had done when they were occupying Iraq, which is to say, Sunni, Shia, and Kurd are these sort of 3 main groups, and we want to build a new state that gives these groups their autonomy, or where these have a representative system, and you're not a left politician or a right politician, or it's not about issue politics. It's about your ethno-sectarian identity, and we do a quota system. And one of the other things was, for example, the legal system that I had talked about was also one thing that was implemented again. So the United States really took these colonial policies and implemented them in exactly the same way, even though they had dramatically failed to work in so many cases before. So obviously the British were eventually kicked out of Iraq. There was strong, the Ba'ath party emerged as a response to that with its brutal rule. And in Lebanon, we had the same system in place until today. The Lebanese civil war from 1975 to 1990 was basically because the system didn't work. So this sectarian power sharing system reinforced sectarian identity to the extent that it led to this, massive civil war, which at that point was one of the worst in the world. So to, a decade later, reconfigure the whole region again according to these sectarian lines, was a tremendous mistake and reinforced these categories. And I think we're living sort of with the consequences of that until today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, that it feels, it just doesn't, the way it seems and the way it feels just feels like a lot of meddling, a lot of ignorance, and doesn't feel, I mean, again, I mean, it doesn't feel right in some ways, but yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing the consequence. The Arab Spring, obviously that was during Obama's first term, I think. Yeah, here, 2009, 11, something like that. And I think it's interesting how I think a lot of people were excited about it for a long time, but more recently people have said, well, there was a lot of progress, but then there was some maybe failures or missteps. How do we look at, again, with in the context of all of the history we've discussed, the Arab Spring and what that was in a modern time, how it was in different countries, and how it was, really, it seemed like a watershed moment, but I don't know, some years from it now, what do we make of it?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously really sad how everything turned out. And it was a moment of great, great hope. New generations that had lived under sometimes really horrible dictatorships and, where speaking publicly or criticizing the government was a complete taboo and so on. I mean, this all broke down actually across the whole Arab world. So, you didn't have one state that was not in some ways or another affected by this, or we didn't have taboos broken, although, you didn't have mass protests in all of them, but in most of them. So it was really a pan-Arab moment. And therefore, you also had a sort of pan-Arab response. I mean, one of the crucial things that happened was also just this pan-Arab counter-revolution. So the remaining regimes, they felt so threatened, and many of them actually those in the Gulf or the monarchies with much more wealth at their disposal, and they tried to intervene across the region. And one of the saddest things is, in a sense, that especially in the sort of multi-religious countries and so on, you had very nice declarations of solidarity, between different groups. Yeah. But then, when sort of the old regimes or status quo powers wanted to sort of split the protest movement, they could easily play on these sort of religious and sectarian differences and attacks on certain communities, and religious symbols didn't help, and split a lot of the movements. But I think it unleashed processes that we perhaps haven't seen the end of it. I mean, in some ways now, Assad, right, President Assad of Syria, was re-entered the Arab League, and in some ways you could say, well, they had this picture of all these leaders now lining up again, and many of them had been in place before. The most dramatic change was somehow in the Gulf, but it's just, sort of the sons of the previous rulers are now in charge. So you have a certain elite change there, but in many other cases, it's the similar faces. And so the old Arab order has in some ways survived. I mean, and even in Tunisia, which was sort of the most hopeful case, now you have a strong backlash against that. So, and it obviously unleashed, I mean, many people died or had their livelihoods destroyed. Millions became refugees. So there's great tragedies happened. But I mean, I would say that this was largely due to the counter-revolution. Obviously, also Iran started to intervene everywhere, also in support of the Syrian regime, and committed tremendous, problems there. The Arab Spring became a way of, I mean, it weakened a lot of the important states in the region, and sort of three major axes that survived, the Gulf states, Iran, and the Turkey allied countries, they fought out their differences in those sort of weakened states. So unfortunately, politics, managed to sort of undermine most of these movements. But I think, who knows? I mean, we have to see this in a longer trajectory, perhaps. I mean, in a few decades, we might look at this differently. But at the moment, it's definitely a bit. It's quite a sad sort of result so far.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really sad. I mean, it's really tough to see, like you said, people that were killed and all the refugees, and it's really awful in a lot of ways.
But I
Um, I,
think, despite all this sort of sectarian violence, you had in almost all states, you have very strong also public displays of, cross sectarian and cross religious and across ideological sort of
yeah,
support. And most recently in Lebanon and in Iraq, you had really mass protest movements against that sort of sectarian system, to say, no, we don't actually just want to be characterized by sectarian identity. We want to be, other forms of identity. And we don't want every interaction with the state be reminded of that, and sort of try to rebel against this institutionalization of sectarian identity that we had talked about, that comes from the colonial period.
yeah.
But so far, not successful. I mean, it didn't. The systems have not fundamentally changed yet.
Obviously, there's many things still going on, stuff in Afghanistan, Iran. Yeah, I mean, I just want to, before I ask the last question, I mean, it's obviously still ongoing. There's a lot to say about it, but I guess Syria's had this conflict for 12 years, super complicated, so many issues. You mentioned just, with the Arab League, Assad, just, kind of rejoining like nothing happened. Where does, I guess, current day Syria and their ongoing conflict, where does this kind of fit in with all of this stuff at the current stage, and understanding a lot of the histories? I mean, obviously Syria, or that region, is super, super old. A lot of civilizations there. There's a lot of stuff that have taken root there. I mean, what do we make of ongoing conflict in Syria?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, you could argue this book was written in response to the Syrian war. I mean, it also really affected me personally. I was really horrified by all of this, and the book starts with some observations from Syria. I visited Syria several times before the war. I studied Arabic there, and there was, of course, there was tremendous it was an authoritarian regime, there was repression and so on and so forth, but it was also really amazing in a way, this multiplicity of, people living together. And I think what happened in Syria is probably sort of the worst that can happen. I mean, it just, half the population displaced, and so many hundreds of thousands are dead. And at the end, there is not much change. And I think it shows that sort of politicization of sectarian identity, and I think that is sort of the main argument of the book. It's not religion and politics don't it's not this explosive per se. It happens at particular moments in time, and in this case, it's you had a pent up anger and for many decades sort of mismanagement. So you have a popular movement. And that initially starts with very good slogans and so on and so forth. But you have a regime that from the beginning, instrumentalizes sectarian identity to undermine the protests. And you have regional states who are willing to also, back the opposition, but also support more sectarian elements of the opposition. And so, it really showed sort of the worst of what can happen sort of in the intersection between local, regional, and international politics, and the invoking of sectarian memory cultures around very important sites such as Damascus, which holds such important significance to all faiths and religious communities and various forms of Muslims, and is of such strategic importance. So yeah.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. I mean, my heart breaks for Syria. All of the things I've read about and talked with people, and it just feels terrible on all sides, even from a very far away place. Never having not been there, it just it feels there's just this big powerlessness feeling. There's nothing. It's very disconcerting in a lot of ways. So hopefully,
Yeah,
you know,
but at
doesn't
the
that way.
same time, you do have now, I mean, overall, I'm telling a story of hardening of identities and so on and so forth. But you do have a sort of, at the moment, again, there's very little hate speech, sectarian hate speech, and
Mm,
that's part because of the Saudis and the Iranians, and everybody is trying to mend fences. So
mm,
you do see
mm,
that actually states, play big role actually in
mm,
either sponsoring or allowing sort of vicious discourse to be spread very widely, or actually repressing that for a while. It doesn't mean fundamentally things are completely shifting, but at the moment we're again a little bit more hopeful that perhaps at least on the state level rivalries can be toned down a bit, and that has a positive impact on regional conflicts like in Yemen, where
mm-hmm,
hopefully this is
mm-hmm.
now coming to an end eventually.
Yeah, absolutely. So the last question I sometimes ask, and I wanna get your idea on this is, you've written a wonderful book. It's thoroughly researched. It's very readable, and it's so informative. What are the for such important issues, w- you know, with the study of Islam? What are the one or two things that you hope readers of the book come away with that you can say, yes, that's what I was trying to express, and you have a good understanding of it? What are those like one or two big goals, I guess, for you for readers of the book?
Well, yeah, I guess maybe just the way we ended. I mean, throughout the Syrian war, there's so many, articles everywhere you read it. Well, Sunni and Shia, they just hate each other, or, Alawis and so on. And of course, it's no surprise, they've been at each other's throat for 1,400 years. Obama actually even invoked this, saying, well, this is age-old conflicts, nothing we can do about it, and so on. And we're also not responsible, we're not involved.
Yeah.
So, just to sort of see the connection between, yes, I mean, there are older debates, but they become, inflamed in particular contexts, and, politics and international relations play a huge role. And also, I guess, yeah, the danger of foreign intervention, but not this should not mean that you take a completely, you have no relations with this region, or you leave everything up to dictators with deep pockets to do whatever they want. But just to sort of be aware that it's not an essentialist conflict that has always been there and will always be there, and also see nuances. I think one of the things I tried to show, and that's why the book is, I guess, called The Making of Sunnism and Shiism, could be called The Making and Remaking, is that, things mean different things to different people at different times, and the meaning of terms can also shift over time. And there were many moments when, some contexts where Sunnis and Shias, people didn't even know what it was. They didn't know which kind of Muslim they were. And others where they could, come together as in pan-Islam and embrace a common cause. That there's actually also a lot of shared between the two sides.
Yeah. Well,
And probably just more broadly, sort of the importance of global history, of seeing global connections. So
yes,
here, the
yes.
connection between the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia, but also connecting that to, European empire and eventually to American interventions and sort
Hmm.
of global,
Hmm.
global power struggles.
Yeah.
I think that's only by doing that can you actually really explain what's going on.
Absolutely. I fully agree with you. Well, the book is called The Caliph and the Imam: The Making of Sunnism and Shiism. It's through Oxford University Press. It's out everywhere. Where is the best places that people can find you, whether that's online or anywhere else?
Yeah, I'm still on Twitter at Toby Matthiesen, and I have a website. And yeah.
That's great. That's great. I'm so grateful that you gave me your time and your energy for a couple hours to talk about these important topics about a very wonderful book. Big thanks. It was so much fun. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for your amazing questions and for really digging into this long topic. And I hope we haven't put off too many people by talking so long about it.
I hardly doubt it. So, big thanks.
All right. Thank you very much.